For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. Former Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez was elected over the weekend to chair the Democratic National Committee. He's vowing to rebuild the Democratic Party while changing the culture of both the party and the DNC. Keith Ellison, the favorite of the progressive Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, urged unity behind Perez, saying Democrats don't have the luxury of being divided. The AFL-CIO says if the leaked draft of the Republican health care plan is the one they go with, it's a non-starter. AFL-CIO President Rich Trumka says the leaked GOP health care plan lowers the health care bar when we should be raising it instead. He says the GOP is lowering America's health care under the guise of reform. Trumka also noted that the Republican plan would slash health care for tens of millions of Americans and impose a new tax directly on America's working people, threatening to destroy the health coverage we earn on the job. The recent victory by the National Nurses United California Nurses Association at Kaiser Permanente after a 17-month struggle has secured a good contract for 1,200 Los Angeles nurses. Another 550 nurses at 21 Kaiser hospitals across Northern and Central California just became NNU-CNA union members. Deborah Berger is co-president of the National Nurses United and president of California Nurses Association. She says the Los Angeles Kaiser nurses were long overdue for a pay raise.
These nurses have been without a pay raise for over 6 years. So this settlement is huge in many, many ways because those nurses have not given up. They continued the struggle, and I am just really proud that they're part of the CNA-NNU family.
Berger says the Los Angeles Kaiser nurses made significant gains in this new contract.
What they got was wage gains up to 34% over 4 years. And for the nurses that had not received a pay raise in all of those years, there are some retro lump sum payments for those nurses, which is really precedent-setting for nurses that have been without contracts for a long time.
The union nurses also ended mandatory overtime with the 550 new union nurses at Kaiser and approval of the Los Angeles Kaiser contract. CNA now represents 19,000 RNs in California.
Sponsored by Iron Workers Impact, now reserving spots for this year's groundbreaking conference, welcoming contractors to grow their business by networking and attending world-class breakouts. More on this event in San Diego, happening March 19th through the 22nd, is found online at impact-net.org under Events.
Brought to you by UnionJobs.com, posting jobs for unions, socially allied, and community organizations since 1997.
You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit laborradio.org.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show.
I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown in the bathtub.
You bet I cut the taxes at the top.
How dare you? How dare you? Go ahead. Make my day.
The Rick Smith Show starts now.
Welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for being here today on the big program. Lots of things to get to, lots to talk about. Evidently, the next Cold War has begun. I don't know if you saw the news, the information coming out of the Trump budget talk. but evidently massive increases in defense spending. And look, you knew it was coming. He ran on the idea that we're going to massively increase our war footing. We're going to be aggressive, and there's going to be another ramping up of what's going on in the Middle East. So expect that, and expect the funding to go with it. So no more butter, no more sugar, no more shoes. It's guns, baby. And at least that's what the Treasury Secretary had to say. Well, actually, what the Treasury Secretary had to say this weekend was kind of interesting, because it's of the mindset that you can have your cake and eat it too. Evidently, they're not going to cut Social Security, not going to cut Medicare. They're not going to cut Medicaid, which are the large drivers of our budget. They're not going to do any of that. They're going to cut taxes for the middle class, they claim. They're going to cut taxes for retirees and working people. They're going to do that, or so they say, again, with more tax cuts for folks at the top, because, we can't. Their definition of middle class is interesting to me. It's anybody who makes like over $250,000 a year. They're going to get a huge windfall. The working people of the country, a couple bucks, like the Bush years. If you remember the Bush tax cuts, everybody got a couple of bucks, but if you were at the top, wow, did you make out? And you made out huge. They're going to cut down on the number of tax brackets, and they claim they're going to create a level playing field for U.S. companies to compete in the U.S. and in the world, and they're going to throw out a 20% import tax, so to to talk about encourage domestic production. Something I'm interested to see how it plays out. Really, I am. Because I've always said that we need to have some kind of a leveler, some kind of an adjustment, some kind of way. And this is, not something I'm horribly opposed to. Now, it's going to be interesting to watch that, because this idea of tariffs pops out of Trump's mouth, how many people who were for it are now against it because it's only Trump. And as I've said before, I will resist everything he does that I disagree with. If he wants to build roads and bridges and invest in infrastructure and those things, I'm happy to help. I want him to succeed where we all do better. In those places where we all do worse, we will resist and we will fight and we will do all of that. But, on the things I agree with, no, I'm not insane. Now, what caught my attention over the weekend, and it's one of those moments where you go, duh. Mnuchin said on Fox News that the administration, quote, fundamentally believes in dynamic scoring. And what that means is that we're going to wish and hope. That means we're going to throw out the most rosy, grandiose picture we can possibly come up with around revenue and use that. Not the more conservative scoring of reality, but the big grandiose hopes. And then if it doesn't happen, well, we just run up massive deficits, which will be fun in April to watch how the Republicans do the gymnastics around that. But that's a question for another show. The dynamic scoring. We've heard this before, and again, it comes back to these assumptions that by cutting taxes, by giving the wealth class more money, that they're going to allow it to trickle down to everyone else, and eventually it comes back in the form of economic activity, and revenue is raised magically through more economic activity. Reality, we've been doing dynamic scoring since the 80s, really, and we've now got a $19 trillion debt. And you understand, we used to pay our bills because we had a tax rate that said we're going to tax and pay our bills. Then we came up with things like dynamic scoring, things like trickle-down economics, things like, if we give them all the money, they'll know what to do with it. And yes, they do know what to do with it. Make more money for them, not so much for us. So to me, this is going to be the part that I really want to watch, the dynamic scoring angle. Because look, we've seen this movie before, and we've seen it before. This is like the Rocky series. There's going to be 100 of them, and it's going to just never seem to end. And, the reality is the more you look at this, the more it doesn't change. It's the same movie. But anyway, tomorrow, cannot wait. Get the popcorn. The State of the Union. Didn't think that at the beginning of the year, wasn't sure if there would be one. Wasn't sure if Trump would be ready to look presidential yet. Evidently need a giant restart. Because, well, first month, not so good. Lots of things that make you go, that's strange. The Russia stuff, things absolutely. I wonder if he'll address it. I wonder if he will attempt to try and convince us that there's no there. I know he's going to talk about the campaign. I know he's going to say how much he won by. I know he's going to probably throw out illegal voters, and because he can't help himself. It won't be on the script, but I don't think he can help himself. And you look at, again, we keep throwing this stuff out to where the election's been over for months, and yet still making references to it. It's scary stuff. And the thing that bothers me is what we're seeing this administration right now. You keep hearing all of the Nixonian kind of rhetoric. In fact, John Dean came out over the weekend and had some interesting things to say about Trump. The paranoia of this administration already has got, it's just mind-blowing. And the fear, and again, this is one of those moments, and I can't tell you how many conversations and how many articles people have sent me on, Rick, you're right. There's going to be, whatever. This, either the Reichstag fire, another 9/11, another Pearl Harbor. There's going to be something to save this guy. Because all arrows are pointing towards real trouble here. And for people who truly do love this country and truly want this to be what we grew up believing in, where we're heading is scary times, because not only is Trump paranoid and narcissistic and thin-skinned and all of that stuff and unpredictable, I argue his number two is actually worse. And I've had these conversations with people who go, no. Pence isn't, he's an establishment guy. He's conservative, but he's all this stuff. And I'm going, no. The guy scares me because he's crazy. This theocratic, this stuff scares me as much as unpredictable and thin-skinned. Because look, it's the agenda. And we saw over the weekend a couple of stories come out about Betsy DeVos. And, again, what we've been saying here on the program for a long time. And again, it's about waking up. It's about getting involved and getting active and going to these town halls and going to these meetings and resisting and holding these people accountable. Let them know someone's watching, because at some point it's going to be the Republicans who are going to save this country, whether you like it or not. It's going to have to be, because they control all the levers of power. And the sad reality is, if they continue to remain silent, and I don't know what the Russians have on them, but if they continue to be silent, if they continue to allow this insanity to go the direction that we see it going, well, the blood of our children is on our hands. That's the sad reality in this. Because the massive ramp up in defense spending should be fairly concerning and should really be that red flag. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the mental status, the paranoia coming out of this White House, and a little bit about us as well. Also going to talk with Terry Anderson's daughter. You may remember Terry Anderson, the former AP bureau chief in the Middle East, captured hostage for I think it was 6 years, from 85 to 91. She's written a book. We're going to talk to her, and also a little bit about the Pennsylvania budget. Your thoughts, questions, comments, Rick at thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Save the USA is drowning in crafted lies. Save the USA and resume the ties it bind. Stop taking all our money and shipping it offshore. Do the job you're elected for.
Saving work in America, one show at a time. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1942. That was the day that 27 Japanese women working in the Seattle public school system handed in their forced resignations. In the aftermath of the attacks on Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese hysteria swept the United States, especially the West Coast. 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry were sent to live in 10 internment camps by executive order of President Roosevelt. Many of these U.S. citizens sold their homes and businesses, often for a fraction of their value, before they were forced to move. In Seattle, mothers from Gatewood Elementary School circulated a petition for the removal of Japanese office employees from the schools. The school district pressured the women to resign. Even James Sakamoto, the editor of the Japanese American Courier, encouraged the women to voluntarily leave their jobs. He met with the women at the newspaper's office and told them they should resign before they were fired. Faced with such pressure, the women wrote a resignation letter. They wrote, "Most of us have received our education in local schools and have been proud of the fact, as we have been proud of our positions as employees." Word of the resignations quickly became headline news in local newspapers. Several protests were held in support of the women. Students at the University of Washington circulated a petition on their behalf. They gathered more than 1,000 signatures, declaring the treatment of these office workers undemocratic, intolerant, disrespectful of the rights of American citizens. In 1986, the governor of Washington signed into law an admission of wrongdoing toward these women and payment of reparations for their forced resignations. Like what you hear? Check out more at laborhistoryin2.com. Back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind, you can email me, Rick, at thericksmithshow.com. You know, over the weekend, I was looking at my Twitter feed, and up popped a tweet from Roger Stone. And, you know, as crazy as he is, but, you know, and one of those InfoWars guys, he tweeted out another InfoWars fan told me he's ready to die for real Donald Trump and American freedom. And you go, not so much family, but to die for Donald Trump, really? And you look at the guy, you go, sadly, yeah, I see that. And, you know, the reality is we're heading into a very scary time because, well, I think we've got a guy in the White House who has some serious problems. And here to help us work through some of them, not just his problems, but also some of ours, perhaps. I've asked our good friend Propane Jane to come talk with us. She's a fantastic blogger, writer, tweeter over at Doc Rocket Rock Tex 26. Jane, thanks for taking time for us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me back.
I appreciate it. You know, I look at this. You know, you got this guy saying, "I'm willing to die for Donald," and you go, "Really, really."
Really, he's their savior. He is their knight in shining armor, and you know, nothing anyone says is going to make them see him any differently at this point.
Now, I mean, I look at this kind of hero. Yeah. I look at this kind of hero worship, and I don't think there's anybody I've ever thought of that, you know, in politics where I go, I'm going to die for that guy.
Right. And you know, I mean, I think that it's, you know, when it gets to that level, you know, it really becomes an issue of, you know, shared cultural identity. And so, you know, like you said, I mean, no, he's not in their family, but in terms of, you know, how they see themselves and their culture, you know, he is basically the poster child. And so, you know, it's not just propping him up, it's propping up an entire ideology. And culture.
It's scary stuff. You know, over the weekend I was looking at the budget proposal that's being leaked, that's been, you know, floated, and, you know, part of it, the massive cuts, is to basically all of the institution of government. It's basically as I look at it, restraining every vehicle, every arm of the federal government that could restrain the power of the presidency. And to me, I'm looking at the paranoia coming out of the White House, be it Donald Trump, be it Spicer, and I look at this budget and all of this stuff. This just seems to me to be, your classic kind of authoritarian move.
Yeah, it is. It is, and it works in terms of furthering obviously the agenda of the oligarchs and that piece of it. But the other aspect of it is that when you get these people in these different agencies, and their main goal is to tear that agency apart. It's meant to make that government agency incompetent, right, and useless. And so as a society, you just look at that system and go, oh, okay, well, it's not worth anything. And so why are we hanging on to it? And so they have to sort of create the conditions where those institutions are worthless in order for us to, basically go along with getting rid of them is what they think they're doing.
Well, I mean, they're creating the crisis by which they can take advantage of. And this has been the Republican playbook for many years, running around yelling and screaming that government doesn't work, and then, doing everything they can do to make sure that it doesn't.
Right. Because, you have to further this idea that that you can't get anything positive from a public system, and so therefore let's privatize everything, and let's give the corporations a chance to run it, because the mindset is that the private sector always does everything better. And again, this is how you end up with Trump, who obviously puts himself forward as somebody who's been a successful businessman. And whatever his approach to business, regardless of what the facts on the ground are in terms of his, history with debt and bankruptcy and all of that, the stereotype that he's latching onto is one of this, 1% successful business owner, and so he knows how to fix it way better than any of these public sector government programs have done before. And so that's how you get people going, okay, on the one hand, keep your government, and are they are sort of complaining that there isn't more access to care, but then at the same time, politically, they are voting for Republicans and voting for this party that is ultimately getting us into wars, creating more veterans. And then not actually funding the system to treat them when they come home, or house them when they come home. And so again, it's a bait and switch, and people don't really know who's hurting them and who's helping them.
Right. Over the weekend, I had a couple of conversations with people who push back on the idea that Trump has a mental illness and that narcissism and all of that is part of a mental illness. That they look at him as someone who is very shrewd, someone who is very calculating, and that all of this is a facade, and all of what we're seeing is just the shiny thing to distract us from what they're really doing and getting away with. Right.
I obviously, this morning on Twitter, kind of in preparation for coming on here, I kind of had some little conversations just on this ongoing topic about, Trump's mental health and what is and isn't appropriate for us to say about it publicly. And, it turns out that I work Sunday night in the ER, and so it's always, as I'm there at work and I'm seeing these patients that are being brought in, purely because of something they did in a fit of narcissistic rage, that do not have any other, do not meet any other criteria for any other depression, such as, any other disorder such as depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety disorder or even a substance abuse disorder. But they've gotten into an argument with someone and in the fit of rage have done something very impulsive. And so when that person gets brought into the ER, and we have to determine is that patient safe, and we speak to family and we speak to, to people that know that person, it's uncanny because this is what people say. People say, oh, well, that's just, we were just thinking that was his personality. And, yes, he can be sort of arrogant and all of these sort of excuses for, people's behavior. And the process that we have to undertake as clinicians is to say, hey, all of these things you're describing are actually evidence of some significant pathology, and this person actually is going to need some help. We can't just sort of, move forward after, this person, keys up your car or does these sort of, impulsive, sometimes dangerous things. We can't just sort of dismiss that as, oh, that's just, he's just a bad person, particularly if it's causing, consequences to that person's life or to other people's lives. And so I think that's where the disconnect is for a lot of people, is that, a lot of us are fortunate enough in that sense that we haven't come, up close and personal in our own lives with somebody who has this really toxic, personality disorder, or who has a mental illness that is untreated, whether it's a personality disorder or some other what we call Axis 1 diagnosis like anxiety or depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And so, when people are experiencing these types of problems, there's varying levels of insight into how problematic it is. And so, and a lot of times the reason why the person is not being brought to treatment is because everyone around them is busy going, oh, well, that's not really mental illness. And it's amazing, as a clinician, I mean, when the person can be in very dire circumstances, like they wrecked their car or they attempted suicide or they did something, and we're standing there going, actually, no, this is an illness. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. And how people, even in that situation, in a crisis situation, are still pushing back against that label because the stigma is just so pervasive and scary for people to accept that that's what's going on.
Right. So, I got a couple of tweets from people, saying, hey, how do you explain to people that, in talking about mental illness and Trump, that you're not actually slamming them or, trying or making things more difficult for people who are suffering from mental illness and getting treatment and moving forward, that you're not making that stigma greater.
Right. My advice for that is, it is always, if you see something, say something. We are not, criticizing him. We are not calling him I am not calling him a bad person. Now, obviously, there are people who are choosing to take that route and say, oh, he's just a bad person. But as human beings, we, with human brains, we all have the propensity to become mentally ill at some point in our lives. Some of us have a higher propensity than others because of genetics or because of environmental stressors or because of other medical conditions that we have or medications that we have to take. So the first part of it is just understanding that, mental illness is not some, sort of honorary club that only certain people get to be in. And that all of us, no matter our socioeconomic status, no matter our ethnicity, we can develop mental illness. And the sooner that we stop sort of kind of cordoning it off to certain people, and you can only be mentally ill if you're a nice person, or if it's if it's out of your control. I mean, all of these sort of definitions that people are assigning are totally just ignoring just the basic biology of how illness works. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that mental health literacy in our country.
Yeah. Interesting. I look at this, and again, I go back to, you talk about the attacking someone with mental illness. And, I look at Trump and I keep going back to, something very, very simple. You want to make sure that people are getting treatment. You want to make sure that people are getting the help that they need. And at the end of it, I look at Trump as someone who's not getting the help that he needs. And it's, and while I understand we don't want to have people attacking folks with mental illness. We don't want people to, make that more difficult for people, make that stigma greater. We do want to make sure that they get the help they need. And Jane, I appreciate you taking time for us. Thanks so much for the insight. Gonna take a quick break. Right back. Stick around. You listen to the Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labour.
This is a Radio Labour World Report by Mark Boulanger. In the report this week, a major breakthrough in negotiations for garment union leaders fired in Bangladesh, and how unions in Texas are fighting attacks on automatic payroll deduction arrangements. This is Radio Labour. There has been a major breakthrough in efforts to halt the attack on garment worker unions in Bangladesh. The government has been trying to clamp down on unions in the garment sector even harder because of a strike by thousands of workers in December. The workers were demanding an increase in the minimum wage to a living wage, something they and their families could live on. The negotiations with the Bangladeshi government were conducted by the global unions Uni and Industrial. Industrial represents some 50 million workers employed in a wide range of sectors, from mining to manufacturing to garment production. I talked to Walter Sanchez, the General Secretary of Industrial, about the negotiations with the Bangladeshi government. I asked him what happened.
It's a very happy day for all the union movement globally because, we finally got the release of all the 35 unionists and workers that were jailed since December, and some of them were jailed in January. Basically, the agreement that we reached with the Labor Ministry and the Employers Association is that on the top of all the workers being released, we'll strive for all the charges against hundreds of workers to be dropped, and the unions will be reopened. They were closed because of the crackdown of the police. And they would drop the charges against the tax investigations that they were doing to put pressure on the unions. So this is a very, very important breakthrough that comes after a long, very strong international solidarity campaign carried out by hundreds of thousands of workers, including Labor Start campaign, including actions in embassies, actions in the social media, and also pressure on the brands with which we have global framework agreements.
In the reports coming out of the country while the Bangladeshi government was cracking down on unions in the garment sector, there were reports that unionists had fled their workplaces to hide in the countryside because they feared charges were being brought against them. Does this agreement that you've just negotiated with the government mean that the charges against the union activists will be dropped?
Yeah, that's the compromise that was established. Of course, the charges were placed by different actors. That means some companies, some local authorities, the police itself. So the compromise from the government and from the Employers Association is to go down and ask all the parties that put up charges to drop them. So that means that we expect that in the coming days, all the charges will be dropped. So we'll be monitoring so that all the charges are dropped finally.
Give us some background on this situation. Why has the government been conducting this most recent crackdown on unions in Bangladesh?
The thing is that in December, there was a very important strike to improve the wages and working conditions. And the reaction of the employers and the government was very strong, very brutal against the workers. There were about 1,500 workers fired, and then the incarceration of 35 union leaders, and also the persecution of unions, closed down the unions, cracked down on on ILO activities. So a series of repression took place right after that. And we fear that it's the intention of the government to prove the world that Bangladesh has to remain a low-wage country in which workers work up to 60 hours a week to receive about $60 a month. So I think their intention of the government was to avoid workers to have working conditions improved. So, and that in this sense, the actions of the workers were even more important, and the reaction that all the union movement globally and the international solidarity took place, it was even very much important and symbolic to keep the fight for a living wage.
And that's it. International labor news you can use. Radio Labor's newscasts are available on its website, iTunes, mobile phones, union websites, and community radio stations. Follow us on Twitter @Radio Labor. I'm Mark Boulanger. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
Bringing sanity and rational thought back to America. Rick Smith.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Not sure what happened there with Propane Jane. I got to wonder how much the NSA is playing it. No, that's just paranoid. I think it was just cell phones. You know what happens? They're cell phones, which is why Art Bell left the industry, by the way. Too many cell phones. Anyway, interesting that I actually agree with Chris Christie on something. He was on with Jake Tapper, and he said the Republicans welcome to the world of responsibility. He said, look, he hosted some 160 town hall meetings in the last 7 years as governor. And here's a guy who loves to be combative anyway. But he went on to say that the fact is that right now the heat is on the Republicans. It's on us, he said. And I said this at the meeting of the governors yesterday, that we asked for the authority to change the country. We now have 2/3 of the state houses in America. We have the House, we have the Senate, and we have the White House. It's now on us to produce results. He said, quote, the one thing, and one of the things that we need to do is engage with the public. Now, he did throw out the professional protesters thing, but the idea of engaging with the public is something that Republicans are going to have to do if they want to ram through their agenda and not have mass rioting. Little Marco, as you saw over the weekend, said no, people were being mean to him. They were heckling and screaming, and that's why he's not doing it. And just because someone's going to be mean to you doesn't mean that, well, if you're afraid of someone being mean to you, politics, the last place for you to be. But here's the thing, and this is why these town halls are so important, and why you should be demanding that every representative in this country stand in front of their constituents and say, this is what we're doing, is because the poison that these guys are pushing, they didn't run on. You look at most congressional districts, they're so badly gerrymandered, there's not really a choice. And one of the things I've always said is that, maybe voter registration needs to be taken into account to kind of level the playing field to where you're talking about ideas and not, talking about which districts are most gerrymandered. We don't have the competition of ideas anymore. What we have is, the Republicans who just play the game so much better. And you ask Republican voters, at least in my world, what do you think of this policy? You go to the Affordable Care Act, and they're against Obamacare, but they like the idea of having health insurance accessible for small businesses, for people who are self-employed, for people who can't afford it. They like the idea of making sure that everyone has the personal responsibility of getting insurance, even if they can't afford to pay for the for-profit. Because look, at the end of the day, not everyone can reach into their pocket and pay for health insurance. Sorry, just not going to happen, especially when you're looking at health insurance being 10, 12, 15 grand a year. People like the idea of that. Now, you start talking about the Republican ideas, and Republican voters, most of them seem to be, well, that's not what we stand for. Yes, it is. And the reason that Republicans have such a hard time with these forums is their ideas are basically unpopular. Once you get past the bumper sticker sloganeering and the rhetoric and you get to the actual functional part of governing, people go, wait a second, that's not what we signed up for. We like the rhetoric. We like, repeal and replace. We freedom, liberty. We love that stuff. But when freedom and liberty means pay or die, not so much. And again, it depends on which side of this aisle you fall on. As employers continue to shift healthcare costs onto their employees, this has been a 30-year march. This isn't new. And it's interesting to me, I have this conversation almost every weekend with people saying, my healthcare premiums keep going up. And you go, why is that? Well, that's because the employer is shifting it over to them. Saying, you know what, those increases that we used to be paying for years and years and years, you're now paying. And it's now something that we're keenly aware of where we weren't before because it was part of our wage package. So I go back to this. The idea that, look, their ideas are not, in my view, functional, and they're not really popular. And when we finally find out what they're going to come out with their replacement plan, I think we're going to be really unhappy. While you may not be thrilled with the Affordable Care Act, I think you're going to be really unhappy with what the Republicans come out with. Now, Trump is going to come out with, I think, something that is going to make everybody really happy because it's going to give you everything that you possibly want with no way of actually doing it. And this is kind of, in my view, the world in which we live in that Trump makes all of these grandiose problems. He's a great salesman. He is. He's fantastic. He could sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman with white gloves on her wedding day. But the reality is, functionally, no. Bad stuff is going to happen. And for people like me, I go, well, how many people die because of this? It's easy to have the conservative mentality. Well, be a rugged individual. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you can't make it, tough on you. I'm a little more compassionate than that. Because I was at that point at once in my life as a child. Don't want anyone to ever have to go through that kind of insecurity. And I guess that's the difference between the right and the left. And you look at the left and they point to the right and say, well, they've got mental health problems because they're not compassionate. Because they don't care about this country or anyone but themselves. And the right looks at the left and says, well, you've got mental illness because you do care. And the question is as a nation, what direction do we head into? And that's the weird thing about all of this. And what I fear is the pendulum keeps swinging to the extremes. And these conversations get more extreme. And then we just completely stop talking to each other. I love engaging people that I disagree with because I want to know what they think. And in fact, most conversations I have with people they turn into interrogations actually, because I do want to know what makes someone look at Donald Trump and go, you know what? I'm willing to die for that guy. I'm willing to die for the rhetoric that he's spewing. What is it about them? That's just one of those things. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Back with Victoria Jones, Talk Media News. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1937. That was the day with whistles blowing, the call to strike could be heard through the aisles of Woolworth in downtown Detroit. 108 saleswomen walked away from their workstations and cash registers. The 8-day sit-down had begun. The women saw from the experience in Flint that sit-down strikes were effective. They evicted management, barricaded the doors, and found 200 or so customers still inside the store wanting to join them. The strikers issued their demands: a 10-cent an hour raise, an 8-hour workday, union recognition and a union hiring hall, free uniforms and laundering, and more. Kresge department stores immediately gave their workers a raise in order to prevent similar stoppages. The striking women at Woolworth made themselves comfortable, and the sit-down soon spread to a second store. Leaders from Local 705 of the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Union threatened a nationwide strike if demands were not met. Union cooks provided meals and union musicians provided entertainment. Hotel workers from across the city picketed in front of the store in a show of solidarity. After 7 days, Woolworth's management caved and agreed to most of the strikers' demands. High turnover in the workforce would undo contract gains at area Woolworth stores soon after the sit-down. But the victory electrified retail workers across the country. The sit-down spread to retailers in St. Louis, New York, San Francisco, Minnesota, and Washington. In 3 strikes, miners, musicians, sales girls, and the fighting spirit of labor's last century, Dana Frank notes that, quote, over 60 years later, unions today in department stores all over the country owe their existence in part to the Woolworth strike. Like what you hear? Check out more at Labor History.